We're continuing our discussion here on World War II. Look at some of the how the war was fought on the home, issues on the home front, some of the major figures in the American war effort. Look at General Dwight D. Eisenhower, George S. Patton, George C. Marshall, Trista Nimitz, the D-Day invasion, the Yalta Conference, the Holocaust, and look at the end of the war, the Manhattan Project, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the atomic bombings. There are many tremendous advances taking place during World War II. Advances in medicine, transfusion of blood has started becoming a common tool for medicine. The use of antibiotic substances such as sulfa drugs. Not quite up to antibiotics yet, but it's getting very close to it. And advanced surgical techniques have really saved many, many lives. Aviation made many tremendous advances during the war. In fact, the Germans were working on jet fighter aircraft that are able to start using late in the war, in 1944-45, but production delays and Allied bombings had delayed their efforts, and the jet fighters were of minimal use to the Nazis during the latter part of the war. But also, you have the use of radar widely for the first time. Radar was a way that the Allies were able to track enemy bombers coming in and out of particular areas. And also, counterintelligence proved to be one of the most crucial efforts of the war. The Allies started using code-breaking computers to try to decipher Nazi codes, which by the latter part of the war proved to be very effective in determining the next move that the Nazis were going to make, saving a lot of lives and advancing the Allied cause tremendously. We mentioned the early World War II era intelligence agency, the OSS, performed a lot of tasks, analyzing data and analyzing Axis leaders. But if we go back to the Battle of Midway, this is probably, that's June 1942, this is probably an excellent example of the use of counterintelligence. The U.S. still just barely recovering from Pearl Harbor. The Japanese are primed to finish off the American fleet, but they can't figure out where the Japanese are going to attack. Are they going to attack at Midway, which everything seemed to be pointing at, or could it be back towards Pearl Harbor because the Japanese are using a code on top of a code? Another attack on Pearl Harbor would make sense, but attack on Midway would make sense too. But the problem was Midway is 1,000 miles northwest of Hawaii, and the U.S. didn't have the ships, the air power, the manpower to be in two places at once. But figuring out something about Midway they could use to their advantage. So they'd broken the Japanese code, and something they just couldn't figure out that last piece of information. But the thing about Midway is it's a small island. There aren't a lot of natural sources of water, so most of the water the U.S. Army had to use was brought in from ships from Hawaii. So they decided they'll play a trick on the Japanese. The Army sent out Navy sent out a low-level message saying that from Midway, saying they're out of water and needed Hawaii to send more water to Midway. Well, the Japanese picked that up and they radioed back to Tokyo saying, our target has a problem. And from there, we knew Midway. Because of that, we're able to, American forces were able to surprise the Japanese, win the day, and one of the significant battles of World War II turned the tide of the war in the Pacific. it's a D-Day as well, which we'll get to in a minute. But during the war, America is mobilizing in a way it never had before. Actually, you had rationing, you had conversion of factories for defense purposes in World War I, but now it's even more so than ever. See, America had been preparing for this war for some time. Roosevelt realized that the Nazis would be coming for the United States eventually. The U.S. had to be ready. It's just a matter of when. But by autumn of 1941, months before Pearl Harbor, we were in a shooting war in the Atlantic with the Germans. 1940, Franklin Roosevelt pushed through the first peacetime draft in American history. First time Americans being drafted into the Army without a state of war being in effect. But with this, you have, it was very controversial at the time, but he was able to have something of the military being built up by the time Pearl Harbor happened. But America had bond drives, the civilians trying to raise money for the war effort. It took a lot of money. The U.S. government had borrowed a lot of money to pay for the war effort. You had rationing of all products, food, gas, scrap metal, and so forth. Kids are encouraged to turn in their bicycle tires so the rubber could be used for trucks and jeeps for the military. Copper was asked to be turned in to be used for wiring on Allied ships and planes. In fact, 1943, you didn't have a copper penny; you had a steel penny instead, all part of the war effort. People are given ration cards, these little booklets of coupons of how much they could consume of something in a week. The gasoline rations weren't very common, so you had all these posters asking, was this trip really necessary? In fact, a lot of the early Bugs Bunny and Tom and Jerry cartoons, they were taking place during World War II, early 1940s, and they have a lot of references to rationing, a lot of references to the war effort. Because a lot like modern cartoons, they weren't just made for kids, they were made for adults too. Have cartoonish slapstick comedy for little kids, but kind of the adult aside political jokes for the grown-ups that understand. But all sorts of food products we rationed. Meat, bread, sugar, many other things. In fact, couldn't get sliced bread during World War II because that metal being used in bakers to cut up sliced bread from the large bakeries to stores, it was turned in for use for scrap metal for the war effort. Talked about the prior internment of Japanese Americans. That need to be pointed out that German Americans and Italian Americans, we were at war with those countries, Germany and Italy as well, but they were not interned. It had to do entirely with racial paranoia. Now, as early as 1943, the Japanese could leave the camps they pledged their loyalty to the U.S., but the Supreme Court upheld internment in 1944, citing national security concerns. These Japanese were interned, however, they were given a formal apology by the federal government in 1985 and given compensation for what they lost. But thousands of these Japanese Americans signed up for the military service distinction in the U.S. Armed Forces in World War II. But idle assembly plants were now humming with activities, making instruments of war, putting millions to work. War led to a massive migration of population from city to city, from state to state, from farms to cities. About 16 million Americans fighting in the armed force, serving one degree or another. I thought about 16 million Americans picking up and moving one end of the country to another. They wartime work, but in the wartime factories. Millions of women went to work as factory workers, give them new opportunities while their husbands were off at war. They'd be put up working in these factories for the first time. You had a lot of women being used for employed as test pilots for the first time, make sure these planes work. Sometimes these women were delivering planes to the front to the air bases because men could be spared. The male pilots couldn't be spared. But the industrialization came to the South largely for the first time because of the war effort. A lot of factories come in large cities in the South, but also into smaller cities. So here, for example, here in South Arkansas, El Dorado Chemical started off as as our ordnance works. Basically, it was designed to make ammunition, high explosives for the U.S. Military. So there's a aircraft plant in Camden, which started out during World War II. Still here today. Actually, women did serve, but they couldn't serve in frontline units or any kind of military units. Mostly, they served in support positions. You have a large number of women serving as Navy nurses and Army nurses. Like say, you have the WAC program, the Women's Air Corps program. Basically, women as flight instructors and test pilots and delivering planes for the military. Sometimes as cargo pilots. So the WAVES, this is an Army program, which women basically be signing up for the Army. They would be serving mostly in support positions as nurses, as secretaries, clerks, and so forth. And make sure that troops on the front lines got the support they needed. Now, there are just three branches of the military at this point. The U.S. Navy and the U.S. Marines. Marines, however, are a branch of the Navy, but both the Navy and the Marines have their own Air Force division. But the U.S. Army, what would become the Air Force, was actually a branch of the U.S. Army. It's called at that time the U.S. Army Air Force. But all this is a tremendous effort. Billions upon billions of dollars. Entire economy basically converted to wartime production. It took a lot of took the effort of the entire country, everything we had, to be able to fight the Axis powers. It was the job of this man, General George C. Marshall, to organize the supplies that the military needed, particularly the Army. Marshall had to be helping determine what supplies went to what allies and what our troops needed to fight and where those would be sent to. His job was quartermaster of the United States Army. And that ability for America to produce these supplies and then ship it wherever it needed around the world, and essentially get the troops the supplies they needed to fight, that, as much as anything, won the war. Actually, in the early phase of the war, we have all sorts of stories of brave men standing up to the Axis powers. Bravery is important, but in a fight, a war like this, you need supplies too. It needs to be an even match. Marshall made sure with our troops and our allied troops, with all the supplies they needed, that they had that even match. They had that fighting chance. The will to win, courage to keep fighting, eventually puts America and the Allies over the top. Now, Churchill and Roosevelt had a very close relationship. They discussed issues often during the war. Churchill was a guest at the White House several times during the war. But they met at Casablanca in Western Africa in 1943. A conference between the two of them where they discussed the issues of how to keep the war going, how to fight the war, where to coordinate next, and where to go, and how to keep fighting. So essentially where the major overall policy decisions being made at this and other conferences like this. But, like I say, it'd be up to the generals and others on the ground to kind of figure out all the little details of just how exactly this would happen. At Tehran, in Iran, 1944, Churchill and Roosevelt met with Stalin, the head of the Soviet Union. They further discussed the war effort and the opening of the Second Front in Europe, basically the Allied invasion of France. But these meetings here, the Big Three together, as they're called, the Big Three, they helped determine the course of the war. In 1943, after Sicily fell to the Allies and invaded the Italian mainland, Benito Mussolini was overthrown and executed. The new government changed sides, going back to the Allies, but German seized control of most of Italy's territory and fought on in Italy. But slowly, the Germans being pushed back with heavy casualties on both sides. But on June 4th, 1944, Rome, the Italian capital, was retaken, and by forces led by General Mark Clark, and they continued to push northward. Churchill had called the invasion through southern Italy the soft underbelly of Europe, but with the mountainous terrain and the trench positions of Nazi Germans, it was anything but a soft fight. Now, D-Day, this has been planned for some time. The Allies have been trying to think of a way to invade Europe and attack the Germans head on. This is another example where counterintelligence is a key part of this. But some historians look at the World War II as a series, not just one war, but actually four different wars. You have the War of the Pacific, the war against the Soviet Union, and then two wars in Western Europe. The first one ending in 1940 with the fall of the French government. The second one starting in 1944 with the opening of the Second Front. But regardless of how it's organized or rearranged or categorized, it is all one war. It is all World War II. The entire world basically is involved in it to one degree or another. But this has been planned for a long time. In fact, as early as 1942, America starts building up its forces of planes, ships, of troops in England to try to preparation for the day that they'll invade Europe. The question of whether they're going to invade was still up in the air for the Allied command. The Nazis are trying to figure that out too. Some proposals of invading Norway and jumping south of Denmark. Some saying just attacking Denmark. Some are saying attacking the port of Calais, which was the closest point between England and France. Others said Normandy Beach, just a little bit further to the west on the mainland. But all sorts of different ideas about where they should attack. But all this time, though, the U.S. military and Allied command is basically trying to fake out the Nazis, trying to make them second-guess themselves. The U.S. had spies in Germany who were trying to get information on what the Germans knew, what they were planning, but also double agents working within Germany, trying to convince the Nazi high command that the Allies weren't doing what they were really doing. Dwight D. Eisenhower was the Allied Supreme Commander, an American general, born in Texas, raised in Kansas, West Point graduate, very, that's an upright, dignified man with a lot of personal honor and personal courage. But it basically is up to him to make the final call. He's helping organize everything, making all the final plans, and he's the one decided Normandy Beach. But Eisenhower realized what this meant. That committing Allied forces to this invasion is a tremendous undertaking. If the invasion failed, the U.S. might be able to rebuild its forces in a year. Britain would probably not ever be able to regain the manpower needed for years. Basically knocked out of the war. So, see this picture here on page 903, Eisenhower talking to the troops. Eisenhower's actually very nervous at that point. He knew he's sending all those young men off to die. That's part you have to understand about war. It's not clean. War means men will die. As a military commander, you have to understand that. Eisenhower was actually prepared to resign as Allied Supreme Commander if the invasion failed. He was going to make excuses. He was making the calls. His decision, his troops, and he will resign if it failed because it was all him. But the first landing was proposed for June 5th, 1944. The largest amphibious landing ever. But because of bad weather, Eisenhower decides against it. But for another part of it, like that Allied counterintelligence had been faking out the Nazis for a long time. The U.S. even had fake armies. It's just on paper. It's setting up fake radio traffic. They're sending in the little fake airplanes, fake tanks, basically just paper outlines, just basically just wooden facsimiles. So German reconnaissance plots are thinking that the Allies are about to attack in an entirely different direction. They can never figure out which was which. They can never figure out how many waves were coming. And spy, intelligence, and counterintelligence. The only the other guys can find. It's like the Chinese philosopher Sun Yat-sen once said, "Look, the part of war. Basically, the battle is won before it's even fought. So by deciding where you're going to fight it, what terms you're going to fight it, you fight it on your terms, not on your enemies." That's exactly what they're trying to do here at D-Day. Well, there are 5 landing sites at D-Day. 2 American, 2 British, and 1 from the Canadians. This is the largest amphibious landing ever. Actually, it's hard to underestimate the impact of D-Day. It's here on page 901. This is the second front. Now, Hitler's forces are divided. He has that 2-front war he'd always feared. And his dwindling force was already dwindling in 1944 because of heavy losses on the Eastern Front, that is, with Russia, part because of supplies given to the Russians by the Americans. They're now being squeezed on 2 sides. 3 if you count the 5 in Italy. It was a hard slog. The Allies barely managed to make a toehold on the 5 beaches. But from there, once they were on the beaches, they secured their position, started moving outward from the beach areas. Like say, by August, less than 2 months later, the Allies had retaken Paris. Hitler had actually ordered the destruction of Paris rather than let the Allies retake it, but partisan fighters in Paris, that is, these troops that had been part of the French army before the war, they basically rose up, found their weapons, worked with other resistance operatives, and they retook the city before the Allied armies even arrived, pushed the Nazis out of Paris. But eventually, after wave of troops coming in after the initial D-Day landing, 3 million troops had flowed across France. Paris liberated, pushing into Germany by the end of the year. Actually, one of the American generals of this initial landing, D-Day, was actually the son of Theodore Roosevelt Jr. He had a heart attack a couple of days after the invasion, but was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his bravery under fire. Essentially, with General Roosevelt, they ended up landing in the wrong spot because it was a dawn landing on the beaches, but they had a lot of A lot of bombings the night before, a lot of paratroopers being sent in the night before. And they ended up being off their target by a couple of miles, but Roosevelt said of just moving to the right spot, just said, well, we'll start the war from right here. Now we get the election of 1944. This is an election in wartime. Now, the Democrats nearly lost control of Congress in 1942 due to an extremely low voter turnout. A large number of workers either uprooted or in the military. So in 1944, Roosevelt feels like he has to run again just to see through the end of the war, because it's almost over. They can see the end in sight, but it's going to be a long, hard push for the last few months. But Roosevelt felt he couldn't abandon the country now. So he's running for his fourth term. He dropped his vice president, Henry A. Wallace, a liberal and visionary former Secretary of Agriculture, in front of the earthy and relatively unknown Harry S. Truman. So Truman was from Missouri. He'd been head of the Allied, some of the Senate committees investigating war profiteering and fraud, and covered a number of notorious cases of some contractors trying to sell shoddy machinery to the U.S. Army. So Roosevelt's renominated with Truman as his vice president. And the Republicans go with Thomas E. Dewey. He's the governor of New York. He won a lot of fame as a prosecutor in New York, taking on the mob. But some of the moderate, Dewey played down his New Deal opposition and tried to shake the Republican Party's image of isolationism by favoring a post-war United Nations. Basically, didn't want the illusion that the Republicans just wanted, or he in particular, would just abandon the world after the U.S. had put so much to try to free the world, after so much would have to be done to repair the world after the war. President Roosevelt made the case about the necessity of the League of Nations ever since he ran for vice president in 1920. Now, even more so, he's pushing the idea of a United Nations, a lasting organization of all nations working together to maintain peace and democracy throughout the world. Like I said, he's often referring to the Allies as the United Nations at this point. But the primary issue, though, is Roosevelt's health. He's 63, but he's dying. Severe heart problems. In 1944, there wasn't much anything they could do about it. He had high blood pressure. His health was frail. Heart problems. Spring of 1944, suffered from a long bout of the flu. But he felt like he couldn't leave the presidency in the middle of the war. Campaigned hard, even enduring a 5-hour rain-soaked parade through the streets of New York in an open car. In November, FDR swept a 3.6 million vote victory. Well, it was the smallest margin of victory yet. He had 53.5% of the vote, 432 electoral votes, and Dewey gets 46%, 99 electoral votes. So it goes to Roosevelt for the fourth term. He's elected to 4 terms, but he's going to die shortly into his fourth term. Roosevelt had been the longest-serving president of American history, just over 12 years. But the Constitution changed during his presidency. Instead of a constitutional amendment had been ratified, the 22nd Amendment, 21st Amendment had been ratified in December 1933 to end Prohibition. Been pushed through basically as a means to try to end the Depression by opening up these breweries and putting men back to work that way, brewing and selling alcohol. It proved to be a very popular move. But the 22nd Amendment, 1937, changed when the president would be inaugurated. Up to that point, it had been on March 4th. But you have this long period between November and March between the new president's election and the time he's sworn in. The 22nd Amendment said the president now be sworn in on January 20th. So Roosevelt sworn in at the White House on January 20th, 1945. In his speech, he recounts the words of a former teacher of his. He said, "Things in life won't always run smoothly. Meant to be trending towards a peak only to suddenly reverse themselves. But we must remember that the trend of civilization is always upward." His last major of speeches. Shortly after that, in February, Big Three met at Yalta in the Russian Crimea, the Yalta Conference. Now, the purpose of the meeting was to discuss the final stages of the war and the post-war peace. America and Britain was still recovering from the Battle of the Bulge. It was a last-ditch offensive by the Germans on the French border, basically in Belgium in December 1944. But the U.S. wasn't able to recover from that, mostly because of the efforts of George S. Patton, a famed tank commander. Fairly colorful figure. Basically, he pushed through as fast as he could and took tens of thousands of German prisoners, except the Germans were terrified of him, but as often said, not as much as Patton's own troops were of him. But because he kept them pushing forward, because accepted nothing less than victory, Patton's troops were one of the best units in the Army. He was a tank man, like I said. It's called Blood and Guts Patton because of his tactics, but some of the statements got him in trouble periodically, but except the overall one of America's best commanders during the war. Well, anyway, by February 1945, the Soviets were advancing within 50 miles of Berlin. Stalin and the conference wrote a series of hard bargains. The Soviets had suffered intensely in the war. They could have nearly 20 million dead at the end of it. This is out of a population somewhat less than the U.S., maybe about 120 million people. At the height of the German invasion in 1942, 300 Soviet divisions were fighting 250 German divisions, while the U.S. and Britain had only used 58 divisions at Normandy. But Roosevelt was too tired and sick to debate testy Stalin, and Churchill's Britain was too weakened by the war to offer too much resistance. Stalin refused to give up communist domination of Poland, but the Balkans, but agreed to Roosevelt's request, what he called a Declaration of a Liberated Europe. It's a statement they signed, calling for free elections in all these countries, but failed to provide any method of enforcement or supervision. Essentially, the Red Army had taken in what the Germans had conquered in Eastern Europe, but they're putting in governments friendly to the Soviet Union, that is, communist governments. Here's the question: how are you going to get rid of the Soviet Army? Next, are you going to turn around and start attacking the Soviet Union, or go to war in 1945 as soon as you're done fighting the Germans? Especially when you've got Japan still to fight. So what options are you going to have short of actually going to war or just agreeing to disagree? Well, Stalin also promised to enter the Pacific War 3 months after end of the war in Europe, as especially what the Allies were wanting. They need help. They're taking very heavy casualties against Japan, but they don't want to have to take all these casualties by themselves. Pressure from Russia, the Japanese would probably end the war a lot sooner. Roosevelt also offered extensive control over Manchuria in exchange for Russian entry into the war. Now, critics charged that Roosevelt had sold out Eastern Europe, and he also represented a major diplomatic victory for the Soviets. But Soviet armies firmly in place in Poland and Eastern Europe, as little the U.S. and Britain could do. Roosevelt admitted it wasn't a good deal, but it was the best he could do. Now, the trip had worn out Roosevelt. After his return to the U.S., he delivered his report to Congress and was meeting with Churchill and Stalin. And during the session of Congress, he admitted for the first and only time publicly that he was paralyzed. He sat as he delivered his speech and offered an apology for sitting. Normally he'd be kind of perched up on leaning against a podium, but this time he's sitting. Offhandedly explained it was easier than what he said, having to carry that 10 pounds of steel on his legs. and quickly added that he had just completed a 10,000-mile trip. The Congress applauded his message and prepared for the final push of the war. In early April, Roosevelt left for a brief vacation to energize his spirits and prepare for the final push of the war. But on April 12, 1945, in Warm Springs, Georgia, Roosevelt suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and died. Truman is then summoned to the White House and sworn in as president. The nation mourned Roosevelt, the man that led him to the most desperate times in American history. But through the deaths of the Depression and through the horrors of the heartaches of the war, and nearly to victory. As Truman assumed office, the Soviets were pounding Berlin, slowly surrounding the city, moving through the streets. Two fronts linked up on the Elbe River in late April as the Allies slowly swept through Germany and consolidated control. Hitler, meanwhile, had been in his bunker, dejected, muttering about how he had been betrayed. And on April 30th, the Soviets approached his bunker. Hitler killed himself. 1 week later, Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had assumed command of what was left of the German military, issues his unconditional surrender. Berlin now in Allied hands, the once vaunted 1,000-year Reich in ruins. Nazi surrender. But the liberation of Nazi Germany revealed the true horrors of Nazi rule. The Allies liberated a dozen or so concentration camps and death camps across Germany and Poland, where millions of innocent Jews and others were slaughtered by the Nazis. 6 million people died in those camps. After the war, as the Allies occupied the area, General Eisenhower ordered that all the German civilians be forced to see these camps, marching them through, forcing them to see what the Nazis had done while they stood by. In the war crimes trials afterward, the surviving Nazi senior officials and the concentration camp officers never denied that these things happened. They simply tried to offer the meek defense that they were ordered to do so. But there are some orders that are too immoral and too illegal to carry out. But they did so. How willing they were, the German public was willing to go on this, we're not sure, but there were a lot of people who sympathized with Hitler and quietly applauded. As we can see here from this chart we handed out, just how bad it was that Hitler nearly wiped out all the Jews in Europe. 72% nearly, just under 6 million. Austria wiped out nearly 2/3 of the Jewish population. Czechoslovakia had a pre-war Jewish population of 315,000, 260,000 were murdered. 83% men, women, children. Denmark was able to evacuate most of their Jews to neutral Sweden. In the Eastern Front, the slaughter, people being butchered left and right, roving SS troops going around and shooting people. Civilians were rounded up and shot, and bodies just dumped in large pits. In Poland, you have a pre-war Jewish population of 3.3 million, just over 11% of the population. 2.8 million Jews were killed, 85%. 71% of the Jews in German-occupied Soviet Union, 1.5 million. Estonia, we don't know how many Jews were murdered. But neighboring Lithuania and Latvia, about 89 to 90% of Jews wiped out. We can easily assume probably about as many in Estonia. This was man's inhumanity to man. When Jews were not slaughtered on the arrival of these camps, they're forced into slave labor, or some are just simply rounded up and forced into these horrible medical experiments that are more about torture, just trying to find anything out about medicine, science. So these results of these so-called experiments just they've been locked up because they're just so horrific and inhumane and so botched that they could possibly do no good to anybody. where they perform things like live vivisections, basically take major organs out to see how long someone would live without them, watch them die. When the Jews entered these camps, they're basically forced to strip of all their clothing which was given to the Nazis, which they gave to pure-blooded Germans. The Nazi dentists even take out the gold fillings in their teeth, melt it down for money. Everything they have of value is taken from them. The hair was cut off and basically used to stuff mattresses and pillows. Bizarre monstrosities would have been the horrors of Nazi rule. This is what they were. This was close to pure evil if you can get. But now the war in Europe is over. They start rebuilding. But the Allies now face Japan. The Japanese, however, are putting up a furious struggle. Now, Allied commanders originally predicted to take 18 months after the end of the war in Europe. But the Allies, however, moved much more quickly. Admiral Chester Nimitz, U.S. Navy commander, was put in charge of the effort, and that came to call the Island Hopping Campaign. The Japanese occupied hundreds of islands across the Pacific, and the U.S. is basically like island to island, fighting and pushing back slowly and steadily. Like I said, this is the point where the aircraft carrier becomes so vital to the Allied victory. Nimitz swept through the Gilbert, Caroline, and Marshall Islands in the South Pacific at a dizzying speed in 1944. But as the Allies swept deeper into the Pacific, more airfields were constructed for planes to bombard deeper into Japanese territory. In fact, some of these advances in aviation or the war was giving aircraft the ability to go further on less fuel, much greater fuel efficiency. But in October 1944, the U.S. landed at Leyte Gulf in the Philippines. This is an intense naval battle here, Battle of Leyte Gulf. The Japanese Navy attempted one last desperate gamble at the Battle of Leyte Gulf here in October 24th and 26th of 1944. They lost their last 4 aircraft carriers, and the back of their navy is broken. They unveiled a new super battleship they're hoping would turn the tide of the war, but what they decided to do is they're so desperate at this point is basically try to run it aground and use the big guns on the deck of the ship to try to fire to Allied emplacements. But what happening was the ship was sunk before it even got to the Philippines. This was basically it. General Douglas MacArthur, who had been in command of the Philippines from the Bonus March incident to Japanese takeover in 1942. He left in 1942 telling the troops and the civilians that the famous statement, "I shall return." At that point he did. But the surrender of the Allies in 1942 was a nightmare. Thousands of American troops without supplies or ammunition, forced to surrender, and they're marched without food and water to prison camps 100 miles away. Actually, Filipino civilians who tossed food or water to the American troops who were retreating, called the Bataan Death March. Were shot, killed, or bayoneted on the site by Japanese troops. Countless American troops died, and in the prison camps, the Japanese brutalized the Americans, offered them no medical treatment, very little food, very little water, often using them as slave labor to build railroads and other facilities for the Japanese. The Japanese felt that surrender was dishonorable, but they were signatories to the Geneva Convention, which dictated the fair treatment of prisoners. It is give food, water, shelter, and all the troops have to supplies or name ranks, or just simply identify themselves. But there are pictures distributed in the war of these American prisoners who were blindfolded, put on their knees, and Japanese officers with their samurai swords taking out pictures of them chopping their heads off. The war is very brutal. Japanese brutalized civilians, starved them. The Philippines, occupied China, and elsewhere. But now the Allies are pushing back and very nearly to victory. Now, the islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were taken in early 1945 in heavy fighting. But to capture these two islands, the Allies could now bomb Japanese cities at will. Few fighter aircraft were left to resist the American attacks, and the Japanese at this point were engaging in suicide attacks to try to thwart the American advance, called the kamikaze attacks. Translates roughly to divine wind, part of an old Japanese story about how the Mongols attempted to invade in the Middle Ages, but their fleet was swept aside by a sudden storm. A divine wind saved Japan. So these suicide bombers were calling themselves this new divine wind to save Japan. But in spite of the attacks, Americans persisted along with our British allies. On the night of March 9th through 10th, 1945, a U.S. bombing raid in Tokyo killed 100,000 people. The Japanese knew that they were nearing defeat, but they refused to surrender. Now, Truman knew nothing about the Manhattan Project when he took office. Now, since 1939, the U.S. has spent about $2 billion developing the atomic bomb. Japan and Germany had also worked on atomic bombs as well, to no avail. Soviets were researching one, but never got off the ground at this point, as well as the British. Some of the best scientific minds in America worked in labs across the country on ways to create an efficient bomb using uranium or plutonium. Los Alamos, New Mexico, on July 16, 1945, the first atomic bomb was detonated. Too late to use the war in Europe against Hitler. It had been the first target. The war in the Pacific raged on. The Germans are getting very close to developing what they had called their heavy water experiments, but the Allied bombing raids so disrupted their facilities, which were much more concentrated, clustered area than the United States and the Manhattan Project, that their experiments disrupted and were never completed. The Germans completed designs for a new series of missiles, the V-1 and V-2 rockets they used to launch against London. The Germans would have placed a nuclear weapon on top of those V-1 and V-2 rockets to attack Allied cities. But at Los Alamos, they weren't sure what to expect. Some thought the atmosphere might catch on fire, but what ended up happening was the steel platform the bomb was placed on evaporated, and the sand on the floor the desert floor surrounding the detonation site subjected to such intense heat that it turned to glass. But the war in the Pacific raged on. Some questions of what to do with this. Some scientists wanted to build this just to see if they could build it. Others really wanted to use it against the Japanese and the Germans. Some suggested a test detonation of the Japanese, showed just how seriously this bomb was and that Americans meant business. But that was the plan was nixed in favor of an actual bombing run. Japanese, here, summer 1945, Japanese guerrilla fighters continued to fight on in the Philippines. The war in China continued unabated. In fact, the ship that delivered components of the atomic bomb to Tinian Island, the USS Indianapolis, was sunk a few days afterwards by a Japanese submarine. 900 Americans dead. With or without the atomic bomb, the U.S. feared to have to invade the mainland Japan in called Operation Olympic. Basically a two-phase operation, first scheduled for November 1st, 1945. And second wave, February 1946. Like I said, would have eclipsed D-Day in scale, so massive. Tens of thousands of American dead were predicted for each of these landings. Countless Japanese casualties were predicted. And then even more in the months wore on. 20,000 American deaths would probably be a low estimate. In the meantime, the Japanese were training women and children to strap explosives to their bodies in preparations for suicide attacks, basically to fling themselves against American troops. The U.S. warned Japan repeatedly to surrender or face destruction, but Japanese officials remained determined to fight to the last man, woman, and child. So thousands of civilians or Japanese civilians being trained to hurl themselves at the Americans. 5,000 kamikaze pilots are being trained basically to fling themselves, to fly their planes into American positions. Would have been a bloodbath. But on August 6, 1945, American bomber crew, the Enola Gay, named the plane. It's a bombing crew named the planes. August 6, 1945, they detonated first atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The city is flattened, 70,000 people are dead, but Japan is determined to fight on. The city of Nagasaki was bombed 3 days later. That spent the American nuclear arsenal. 3 bombs were produced. First one designated Los Alamos, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. Another 70,000 killed. Emperor Hirohito decided it was time to end the war. He taped a message to his people, Japan, telling them Japan was surrendering. But the night before the message was to be broadcast, several soldiers attempted to overthrow the government and destroy the tape. They were captured. Basically, there was a coup against the emperor to keep from surrendering. But the next day, the Japanese people heard the voice of the emperor, many worship as a god, for the first time on radio, learning that they were surrendering. Japan finally surrendered on August 14, 1945, signing the surrender papers for the battleship USS Missouri, ending World War II, for the cost of the lives of 70 million people.